Please consent. All right, so I want to welcome you to Preservation and Access to Digital Assets. With me today is Dr. Peter Boticelli, who is from Simmons University. I am also from Simmons University. My name is Kate Benson. I'm the Director of Graduate Admission at our School of Library and Information Science. To get things started, I am just going to pass it right over to Peter, and we'll hear what he has to say. I will also say that if you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to put them into the chat. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end, and if we're able to kind of interject along the way, we'll try our best to do so also. You can also feel free to use the raise hand feature as well. All right, Peter, it's all yours.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm glad to be here to talk about careers in the information professions. So I'm going to try to do this, share my screen, and okay, let's do, and I hope that is visible. Yeah, I think it is. Okay. So the title for this session is Preservation and Access to Digital Assets. So I'll talk about what we mean by digital assets, and then how preservation and access go together, and how, and the larger theme is how and why preservation is such a key facet of working in this in the information field. So as Kate said, I am a professor at the Simmons School of Library and Information Science. My original background is in history of technology, and I then followed a traditional path from studying history to becoming an archivist with a degree in archives and records management from the University of Michigan. And so I've been steeped in archives and also in the world of digital information for the past 20 years or so, and kind of watching as the profession has worked to get ready and deal with the giant tsunami of digital records that we're currently experiencing. And so the concept of digital assets is a complex one. So I'll kind of give you a little bit of background information on what you might expect if you go to an iSchool or to a program like Simmons. Technically, we're a School of Library and Information Science, which means we really were originally all about libraries and librarianship. For many decades. We were one of the first schools in this field going back to the early 1900s. Since in the last 50 years or so, this notion of information science has developed, which is really about information, or really about data processing using technology. So in many of these schools, so essentially if you go to a school like Simmons or in most other iSchools, you're getting a degree in what we just generically call LIS. And this is a master's degree that's accredited by the American Library Association. And what that means basically is if you get this degree, you can call yourself a librarian. And as you'll find out, librarians do a lot of different jobs. They perform many different functions. And so the degree kind of gives you an overall foundation to go into many aspects of library services and handling of library collections. The information science part of it is a little bit more research focused on how users interact with information, how they create and manage and organize information. And many of these schools and programs in LIS also have a strong technology component. You'll find things like human-computer interaction, what's now commonly called UX, user experience design, which used to be web design, then it became, it sort of evolved into from designing systems and now experiences. And so it's applying technology skills like programming and building databases, to the problem of how to provide information to users out in the world. So that's kind of the basis, the foundation of what we do in this field. And again, that library part, that L stuff, is really at the root of what we're about at Simmons. But we're also very big on archives and archives management. The difference between one difference between library and archive, the library field and the archives field, is that our professional association, and I do consider myself an archivist, the Society of American Archivists, does not accredit degree programs. They have various guidelines for what could or should go into graduate studies in archives, but essentially a lot of archivists today are people who go and get degrees in LIS that also include a substantial amount of archives-related coursework. In the past, typically, most archivists would have, say, 3 or 4 archive-specific courses on their transcript that would go along with an LIS degree. Our archives management program is a little bit more extensive. In that sense, we have about 5 courses that are required. So it's giving you a lot of depth in what has really become an emerging field of study in itself, what I'm just generically calling archives management. Some would call it archival studies. It goes by a number of different terms, but essentially it's specific to the archives field. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Another sort of allied field is museum studies. This has traditionally been different from LIS programs. So you'll see museum studies programs that are housed in schools of art history or anthropology, typically. They can be standalone as well. Still, we at Simmons and other iSchool programs have been doing more in the museum space in recent years. We just recently launched a whole course on that's an introduction to museum studies. And so it's an area that kind of fits naturally with our existing base in libraries and our more recent move into archives management. So there's been a kind of expansion of the field over the years, encompassing a wide range of different institution types, from the public library to the research library, to large archival repositories, including the National Archives, as well as state, local, public, as well as private and corporate archives, into having a concern more with museums and the kind of work they do in building and maintaining collections. More recently still has been the emergence of what we at Simmons call cultural heritage informatics. And this is an area that's explicitly interdisciplinary. So what we're trying to do is to really encompass all aspects of managing collections across each of these institution types. We sometimes refer to them as the LAMs, libraries, archives, and museums, but it really also includes historical societies and basically any kind of institution that manages cultural heritage in any of the forms that it occurs. In Massachusetts, for example, we have an institution called Historic New England, which manages historic properties across the region, historic houses, farms, things like that. Those are cultural heritage institutions. And all of these institution types are fundamentally concerned with maintaining physical collections, but also maintaining a lot of documentation about their collections. And increasingly, they're becoming digital. And this is where the concept of digital assets has sort of cropped up in recent years. And I think it's becoming more and more common to think about all of the digital stuff that's accumulating in LAM institutions and really across society as a whole, and treating them as valuable assets as opposed to just bits of information. Certainly in the private sector, just about any kind of corporation or really any institution in society as a whole is increasingly concerned with managing large volumes of information that are essential to operating meeting the mission of the institution. For example, our students at Simmons will work in each of these types really in the full spectrum of LAM institutions, but they also work in places like shoe companies, which are common in Boston, like New Balance and Converse. You wouldn't think of them as archives, but they actually have archives of their shoe designs and their product, their whole product design process has to be documented. So they need archivists as well as librarians to provide the information that people need. So cultural heritage informatics kind of goes along, it overlaps with these other areas, and it also provides a kind of unified view of collections and particularly digital assets. So with that in mind, kind of giving you the institutional background and how we're oriented as a type of degree program, let's think about assets a little bit more. In libraries, we talk about works, or really, let's say, books, which are, when you think of librarianship as it's developed over the past 150 years, it's about collecting these objects and putting them on shelves and making them accessible. In library world, we talk about a work as something that might be represented by multiple books or editions or volumes, etc. So we have a sense of a published work or something that's been prepared for an audience that would go into a library. In the archival world, we have records by contrast, and these are documents that represent evidence of some activities, transactions, the life of an institution or a society, or personal records as well. And so records can be quite varied. When you think of all the different types of information that you as an individual produce and the things that you want to keep or need to keep for over time, it becomes first a matter of managing a very large scale of things. And say the National Archives in Washington has at least 10 billion pages worth of records that have accumulated over the past couple of 100 years. That's a lot of information. And it's also rather varied. And unlike a library, archivists deal with stuff that hasn't necessarily been carefully arranged and published or, say, edited for public consumption. It may be private, it may be secret, it may also just be messy. And it's stuff that we have to kind of deal with at scale as large bulk accumulations of records. By contrast, museums deal in objects. So when you think of paintings, sculptures, prints, photographs, all of those things that museums collect, they refer to them as objects. So in thinking about the physical world, these institutions, each of the LAMs, has developed very specific and kind of specific types or methods of working with collections and working with assets. And their ways of doing things are all really rooted in the physical nature of the things that they're collecting. So obviously books versus, say, papers stored in a box versus a sculpture. They need to be treated in different ways. They certainly need to be presented to users, to the public in different settings. And they need to be, there are different preservation needs for each of these types of objects. So if you go into a library or an archives, you'll see a division of labor and a degree of specialization around these material objects or material things that reflect those different functions and the histories behind the collection. Now, when we move into the digital world and think about digital assets, typically in LAMs, there are a couple of things or ways that we've started to think about digital culture and how it may be both similar to and different from this material legacy that we're dealing with. For one thing, LAMPs have done a lot of work to create digital surrogates for their material collections. So we have digital images that represent scanned pages of books. Archives are increasingly carrying out digital projects to take that vast bulk of records we've accumulated in largely paper form and to produce images of those pages so that for access online. Museums have also done a lot of work to create digital surrogates. Go to any major museum and you'll find the bulk of the collection is now accessible through usually two-dimensional digital images. These may be, they may vary quite a bit in quality. Some may have been created years ago and are perhaps becoming obsolete. Nevertheless, they provide a very useful source of documentation about the larger collection. It's often said of museums in particular that most can only show a very small percentage of their total collection in a public gallery space, typically less than 10%. This is certainly true of, say, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is very close to the Simmons campus. They have about 500,000 different objects in the collection, and only a few thousand can be displayed at a given time. So what happens to that 495,000 or whatever number of objects that normally just reside in dark storage? Well, if you digitize them, now you have at least the potential to exhibit and display those objects to people. And they may include many very fragile objects that normally can't be displayed very often to the public. So digitization or creating digital surrogates has, I would argue, created a body of assets that some might dismiss as mere surrogates or as pointers or access points for people to go back and get the original material thing that has that's the real source of value. But in recent years, we've seen not only a growth of asset of these surrogates, but an increasing drive to treat digital assets as data sources or resources. Nowadays, you'll hear a lot of talk about the so-called digital humanities, for instance, which has become a very hot topic in the library, archives, and museum world, because what's happening is scholars in fields like history and English or in anthropology are coming to the LAM institutions and realizing that if I can get access to these collections in digital form, if I can access, say, pictures of the materials, but also if I can get access to documentation in digital form, I can use that as data in my research and scholarship and teaching in ways that just wouldn't be practical or even possible if I was restricted to using material things. So, all of this documentation that museums have, for instance, in the past has always been kind of invisible to most visitors. You just couldn't pull out the files and show them to large numbers of people, and maybe you wouldn't want to anyway. And there's preservation concerns. So now we're starting to think of ways to not expand the range of assets and also to package them as data resources on behalf of users. So this is a growing area of concern for our field, and it's one that I think will undoubtedly lead to new opportunities for people with those library, archives, and museum collection related job titles. And it's definitely a concern that we've had at Simmons in developing our curricula in recent years. So digital asset management is something that, as I say, is a growing area of interest and concern. It doesn't take away from all the work we've done in the past around material culture. certainly those physical collections are in no way disappearing. They're still there, and they're actually increasing in value. So one of the things we've learned in the past 20 years of digitization efforts is that once you digitize something, the physical thing will probably become into more demand, and certainly will have value that will need to be preserved over time. But with digital asset management, there's a number of ways that, or a number of sort of keywords that I like to bring up that I think point to how a curriculum like Simmons offers, as well as other iSchools, may help, may be reflected in some of the career paths that students will be taking. One keyword that's been discussed a lot as digital assets have become more common is this notion of curation or digital curation. You'll see job titles like digital curation librarian or digital archivist or digital assets manager that are becoming more common. And crucially, what this really comes down to, it's an extension of more traditional notions of curatorship that in a museum context, and specifically, a museum curator is supposed to be a scholar who studies the collection and who then uses that scholarly knowledge to help make decisions about which objects to acquire or to deaccession, and also in making decisions about how to exhibit things. And in doing so, it really comes down to interpretation more generally in a traditional sense. A curator is someone who can interpret cultural heritage on behalf of the public. And so that idea has translated to digital assets as one that means that we're providing both access, we're providing access to collections and also preserving. And in fact, it's each of these sort of fundamental activities that go into managing digital assets. First, making decisions about acquisition, which things to accession into our repositories. In archival terms, this means appraising stuff, which is a course I teach at Simmons, where we appraise, essentially to appraise records means assessing the value of the record and making a decision about whether to acquire it or not. And it's one of the key aspects of archival work that we essentially decide to throw away a very large chunk of all the information that society produces, because the reality is we just don't have the resources to keep more than a small percentage of total records that are being created. So to curate in this broader digital context means being involved in these decisions. It means also taking actions to facilitate access. And we can talk more about what that means. In the library world, it meant cataloging stuff. And for archivists, it meant arranging and describing records so that people could find them and understand what they're about. I've thrown in terms like persistence and precision. So in library world, we talk about how precision of searching. When I go to search for things, I want to be able to find everything that is relevant to my search. And persistence is really related to preservation in the sense that to understand digital assets, I need to be able to have persistent access to things, so that as I search and go back and search again, I want to be able to access the same things and to have some assurance that I'm getting all of the authentic, complete evidence that I'm seeking. And finally, preservation is something that's fundamental to really, it's become an overarching issue for managing and curating digital assets. I've used the word permanence as a reflection of what archives are fundamentally all about, which is those records that are of permanent value to society, that need to be kept on an open-ended basis. So traditionally with material culture, we have certain techniques for preserving or conserving material records. And we have a parallel set of techniques that go into preserving digital assets. The key point I'll make here is that each of these sort of key functions form a complete life cycle of digital information, and each of them are closely related in the digital world. So if you take a degree program like Simmons, we're going to talk about each of these basic functions and how they are closely interrelated, and how our larger mission of assigning value or assessing value, ensuring persistent and precise searching, and the permanence of objects, how all of those fit into the larger mission of information professionals. And then in a longer term perspective, what it comes down to is stewardship on behalf of society. As people create cultural heritage in all of its forms, they look to us to carry out these basic functions on their behalf and to work with people and communities to ensure that what they consider valuable as heritage is accessible and is preserved over time. Few other keywords that come up a great deal in our work at Simmons and other schools. One is collaboration. To work with digital assets means having to collaborate across the life cycle. So we're working with people who actually create digital assets. We're also working with the technologists who will be involved in building the systems and the infrastructure that we need to manage collections. So it's about understanding. If you come to a school like Simmons, you'll learn a lot about libraries and librarianship and archives, but you'll also have to work with and understand the technology side of things to understand the full range of issues that we face in digital asset management. There's also an increasing sense of or need for collaboration across institutions. So if you're building a collection of books or paper records, you may think of your own institution as kind of an island where we bring in stuff and we own it, and we're essentially in competition with the rest of the world. But in the digital environment, we have to work together across institutional and disciplinary boundaries in order to build the technologies, the infrastructure that we need, that we all need, and to serve users on a global basis rather than just locally. Another key term that comes up a lot is project management. A lot of the work that information professionals do today is based on discrete projects, working with particular collections, working with donors on a specific acquisition, solving particular preservation issues. So the ability to organize and to learn the skills that are needed to carry out particular projects over time and to develop the kinds of specialized skills is an ongoing effort. And so a key thing that we hear over and over again from employers in our field is the need for flexibility, which is really kind of flows very directly from project management. So information professionals need to be not just flexible in a personality sense, but they need to have learning skills and an ability to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. Just in the last few years, we've seen major changes in technology. We're anticipating more change over the coming decade or so. The nature of collections is changing. And certainly this whole area of digital asset management itself reflects a major historic change that's taken place over the past 20 to 30 years, and which is probably only about half complete. So there's probably another 20 to 30 years of major ongoing changes that we will need to manage as we help society make the transition from a culture that used to be mostly material and that's becoming increasingly digital in form. So that's kind of where we're at, I think. We're sort of halfway in this sea change, and we're working constantly at schools like Simmons to understand these changes and then to help our students adapt successfully and work with information and collections in all their forms. So that's about it for me, and so we can take questions. I'll end sharing here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. If there are any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll happily call on you. One question I think I have for you is just kind of what are the characteristics that make information science students successful? I think you touched on it a little bit, but I don't know if you could kind of address that a little bit.
Yeah, I see information, the first and foremost, I look to an academic background that I look to curiosity, frankly. Students need to be scholars. To be a professional today in almost any field requires what I'd call applied research skills, or an ability to take a problem that you're trying to solve and gather data, gather information about it, and then analyze the data to understand what the problem is about and to consider possible solutions. So it's and that really, you know, to really so it's not about following a set formula. It's really about an ongoing process of solving complex problems on a day-to-day basis. And that's true whether, you know, if you're a physician, for instance, you know, you have to treat each case differently. You have to look at the data differently. For lawyers, they have to look at each case as being a distinct thing that they need to understand. And certainly in our field in information, every collection is different. We deal in exceptions. We deal in unique and in things that are unique. So to have an inquisitiveness, a curiosity, a creativity, and an ability to innovate, to think, to embrace change and be adaptable are really key qualities.
Yes, which I think can be applied to a lot of different positions and fields. I would definitely agree with that. We did have one question that came into the chat, which is very specific to our degree programs, which is great to see. The question is, what would the design your own option look like in the degree program? So this is for our Master of Science program. And then the follow-up is it a combination of the concentrations offered or something else?
The design your own option reflects the fact that our students end up working in a very wide range of jobs, honestly. If you cross each of those institution types and with all that huge variety of collections and assets, they do a lot of different things. And so in designing the degree program, we have just a very small number of required courses that everyone has to take. And we can talk more about what those are, but they're really just very, very fundamental areas or skills that are required. So beyond those 3 courses, 3 out of 12, you can essentially take any courses you want that we offer. So you can tailor the program to developing quite specific or quite specialized areas of expertise within the field, or you can build a program that's very general, that gives you an introduction to a lot of things that might help you to work in a lot of different settings. So that's kind of the short answer.
Yeah, definitely. I would say I would agree with that. It's very customizable. You know, we have the concentrations where you can kind of follow a more prescribed course of study, but then design your own, as you mentioned, is kind of, you can take electives almost across the curriculum. So, so it's a great option. And right now, actually, a majority of our students, I believe, are in the design your own option, even though we have so many concentrations. I think that is one of the most popular routes that our students take. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about the courses that you teach at Simmons. If you could just kind of maybe mention a few of those and maybe how it relates to some of your research as well.
Yeah, so first I teach archives appraisal. So the history and the practice of appraisal as that making value judgments and deciding what to keep. that's a course I really love to teach because it is so fundamental to what the profession is about. Then I specialize in the cultural heritage informatics area. I actually direct that concentration. So, and crucially, within that area, I teach a course called Digital Stewardship, which covers that full life cycle of critical activities around the creation, providing access, and preserving digital assets. Then I teach a course called, not surprisingly, Digital Asset Management, which is a more advanced course where students go out in the field and interview professionals and develop a case study on how digital asset management is actually being carried out in a given institutional setting. And that's been a great course because it really gives me and gives the students some deep insights on exactly what's going on in the field with technology and with this huge variety of collections out there. So I've literally had students go and study shoes. I've had them study genealogy, resources, and everything else you can imagine, from art collections to anthropology collections to astronomy collections to anything. And it's actually quite remarkable what's happening with technology in each of these areas. And that also reflects in my own research, which has really been focused on developing case studies to help professionals and students and the field understand at a deep level what's happening as we try to build the technologies and methods that are needed to handle and work with digital assets.
Great. Doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand, but you're welcome to. If we don't have any more questions, Peter, is there anything you just wanted to say in closing? Anything about our program or about access in general, just to kind of close things out?
I think it's a great time to consider being an information professional in each of the disciplines and across disciplines. Society, the demand for our services has never gone down. It's only gone up. The demands on society as a whole to manage information is enormous. So it's not a case of, well, are there jobs, is there a need for our services? The bigger issue for us is simply convincing everyone to invest in the systems and services. So we need to be advocates as professionals. That's something else we emphasize quite a bit at Simmons. So I think it's an interesting time, both because there is such a need for what we do and because the culture is changing so dramatically and so rapidly. In a way, we're always scrambling to keep up with new technologies, new forms of information. But at the same time, as we struggle with these issues, we're helping society wrestle with these problems as well. So I think we have a role to play in all aspects of information policy, things like privacy, how we use technology, how technology impacts education, and really almost every aspect of life today.
Well, I feel like that is a great place to end. So thank you so much for your time. I'll just put a plug out there to everyone. If you do have questions following today, you can always reach out to, we have a general kind of information science email that we provided. You can always reach out to us at Simmons as well. I can put our admissions email in the chat, and I'm sure Peter, we can always forward you along to Peter if you have questions as well. We can always connect you further. But thank you so much for your time. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And we hope that you further engage with us. And if you do have any questions about our program or research that's going on at Simmons, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yes. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye.